Okay, we have a bit of time for some questions. I think there are microphones floating around, which we'll get out to you. But first, I think we should start off with the transactional sex among penguins.
You have to cheapen the tone, don't you? No, I already did
curious.
that. It's Adelie penguins, and this was so the transactional sex, which was written up as being prostitution. And this again is it's this idea that we use familiar behaviours in us to describe behaviours in animals, which may be, of course, unrelated, but we're very, very anthropocentric, and we think about human behaviour a lot and see it in other organisms and then say, well, they're doing that because we do that, or the other way around. So female Adelie penguins will have sex with unattached males in exchange for a pebble.
What do they do with the pebbles?
They build their nests with the pebbles.
Oh, okay.
Pebbles are really important to them, yeah, worth a shag. They also, I mean, there's an interesting history story in here as well, because a lot of these observations of Adelie penguins came from Shackleton's last mission. And there was a scientist on board who was just appalled at the behavior of the Adelie penguins, to the extent that there were public records published about normal behavior of Adelie penguins and various other animals in the Antarctic. But he was so shocked by the behavior of teenage male Adelie penguins that he wrote up the notes in Greek, and they were only published in private files that were only available to 10 members of I think it was the Linnaean Society in Greek. But it also included necrophilia as well.
Good. Okay, questions from you guys.
I am so sorry.
Questions from the audience. Who?
Hold on a sec. Do you want to wait for the mic to come up to you?
We've got a few microphones around.
Where would you place consciousness in all of this?
Well, that's a hell of a question. And it's a question that I'm going to semi-dodge, because it's very difficult to establish what we actually mean by that question. Primarily because it's very difficult to establish what consciousness actually is. So it's a thing that we talk about a lot and we think that we recognize in us and in other species, but is very, very ill-defined and really depends on the context in which you're asking that question. Cats and dogs, are they conscious? I think they are by whatever measure we're using. They're certainly aware of themselves and they're aware of other organisms. Do they have human-level consciousness? Well, of course not, because only humans have human-level consciousness. Now, I think consciousness in the way that we think about behavioral modernity is very closely associated with the types of things that I've been talking about, such as the ability to think abstract thoughts, to the ability to imagine the minds of others. And that is very closely, I think, associated with the emergence of stronger communication skills and language and the development of language, the ability to say, I walk through this in sort of simplistic terms, that, the ability to identify what someone else wants or what someone else is thinking is incredibly important, so that you can communicate important ideas that might be dangerous or related to sex or things like that. But of course, I very casually say this is to do with the development of language. Well, the development of language is also an immensely complicated thing, which is also to do with population size and population structure, but the anatomy of our larynxes, the size of our brains. We know of genes that are essential for language development, but aren't definitely not triggers for modern language development. We see those same versions of the genes in Neanderthals, but not in chimpanzees, and so on. So, in a sense, I'm sort of dodging the question by saying I don't think we know how to answer that question, because the question is framed in, not you, but the question is framed in such a way that it's very difficult to understand what the question actually is. My God, that was hand-wavy.
Thank you.
Who else wants to ask questions? There we go, we have one here. Get a mic over there, thank you.
I would prefer to take questions alternating between men and women, if that's possible.
Really good. But,
thanks.
One issue about...
One?
The one I'm going to ask you about human evolution is this, that all the evidence about our cultural development, and particularly all the artifacts and the artworks of, say, 50 to 30,000 years ago on have not shown any concept, any feeling regarding the aspect of faith and religion. So did religion develop? Probably from the ancient Egyptians and become anthropomorphic from the ancient Greeks on.
Well, I mean, that's a hell of a question as well. And I'm not sure I agree in terms of the archaeological evidence not suggesting at least profound symbolism. And I think the Lion Man is an example of that. So, I mean, apart from the fact that it is a combination of two different organisms and therefore an imagined being, it quite clearly has some cultural significance. And people have written about, so cave lions were a big part of Neolithic life in southern Germany 30, 40,000 years ago. And it's quite possible that, you know, these are revered and possibly feared organisms. And so I'm not sure I agree that we don't see profound abstract symbolism in some of the artwork that emerges from that time. The second thing is we've got a reasonably good model, I think what is a reasonably good model for what might be considered the birth of religions, and it's a little bit to do with consciousness and our highly evolved brains, and revolves around this idea of it's called agency detection, right? Which is something that we are super cued into. So the idea that when we see something happen, or we see the results of something having happened, we are intellectually cued into trying to work out whether there was agency behind that. And that is a useful trait to have in your evolved tool bag, because if you, and this is the example I give in the book, you know, if you come across the mutilated body of Dr. Fry, right, then it's not useful.
Cry first,
I would weep tears. But it's not useful from a survival point of view to say, oh, there's Hannah, isn't she mutilated? She's not looking great right now. The agency detection that is useful to us is to go, Christ, Hannah's been mauled by a cave lion, and therefore I need to get the hell out of Dodge because the cave lion might want to eat me, right? Now, so that is, I think, a perfectly reasonable, if simplistic, explanation for why agency detection exists in the first place. But with our changing consciousness and our evolving cognitive abilities, it has become so accentuated that we have agency detection all the time for things which can be very easily explained by physics, right? And that's why, you know, a creak in a floorboard at night as the house cools down is scary to us, or a broken twig in a forest is the source of horror for a horror film. And I think that is a reasonable, if slightly hand-wavy, broad understanding of where the emergence of gods comes from. Because when we see things that we can't explain, we attribute agency to that. We attribute a conscious mind when it's nothing but dumb nature. And the thing that I say in the book is that I don't think it's unreasonable to speculate that is the basis for the emergence of gods. But of course, with our evolved minds, we have the ability to tuck those guys away again.
All right, we've had consciousness and religion. Any other easy questions?
Hey, let's do race.
Up here. I think we have one up the top. Is there a microphone? Actually, do we have a female questioner from the top, maybe? We have one over here. Perfect. Could we get a microphone over here? Thank you so much. We'll come back to you in a second. Come back to you. You can go next.
Thank you very much. Nice pictures.
Ah.
Hello.
Hi.
It's Professor Robert.
I didn't know you were here.
I know. I crept in.
Christ, did I get anything wrong? Did I get anything wrong?
No, it's an excellent book, by the way.
Oh, thanks.
Everyone aspired and get it signed.
There you go. You did that.
Thank you. I was just going to say about religion, just picking up on that last question. I'm not convinced by the Lion Man, and the reason I'm not convinced by the Lion Man is the prevalence of zoomorphic figures in our own civilization, and what people in the future are going to think digging through our rubbish tips. And they're going to dig through a layer which relates to my house, and they're going to find the Octonauts. And they're going to assume that I worship a little bare-headed man. And
one of them's a sea otter. As well?
Yeah.
Which one's a sea otter?
I don't know. Quasi's a cat. Anyway, I know far too much about the octonauts. So I think sometimes we overlook the role of children and fun and playing with things, and it's not necessarily religion.
Sure.
But I think the archaeological site that for me absolutely nails it, and it's very difficult. I mean, I hate the word ritual. It's the last ditch attempt. You know, it's like the thing you've got left when you've ruled everything else out.
Yeah.
I can't explain Göbekli Tepe in Turkey 11,000 years ago, pre-farming, being anything other than ritual and religion. Amazing circles of stone pillars with animal characters on them.
What time did you come in? What was
about
up to?
halfway through. Did you do Göbekli Tepe?
No, but I did. I did say that the Venus. I mean, this is our conversations between us influenced the words that I wrote. But I did say that I think the Venuses may well be toys or pornography. You know, the assumption that they're fertility amulets is something that has been written about a lot since the 90s, and I think it's interesting and kind of fun to talk about. It's pure speculation. It's a long way from science. That when they talk about the exaggerated sexual characteristics of I don't know, there are like 9 recognized Neolithic Venus figurine. That's Alice Roberts, by the way. Some of them do have exaggerated sexual characteristics, and some of them don't. The Venus impudique doesn't. People have suggested that the reason that this one, the Holy Fels one, which is the earliest, is shaped like that because of perspective. And it's the idea that you can't see one's own head. And if you were to look down, then these are the exaggerated traits. And these are academic papers. I don't think they're... I think they have some value. But of course, I struggle with that as an argument because I can see your head.
You know what heads look like.
I know what heads look like. And it would have to be a really weird form of social interaction for me to look at you and not think, I think that's what I look like as well.
Everyone around you.
I'm with you on that. I think the line that I said, because you were late, was it's impossible to know the mind of anyone in the current era, let alone know the mind of someone who died 40,000 years ago. But what's important about these figures is that they show that their minds were not different from our own. I can do the whole first half again for you if you want.
Okay, I promise to go back over there, so let's do that.
Okay. Just be interested in your thoughts on development of language.
Yeah.
Because that I would have thought would be quite a key element to how things develop. If you were sort of a Neanderthal and you couldn't speak, then all you could do is show somebody this lump of rock, and it's very good to bashing things with, but I can't tell you why it's good, and I can't actually discuss why I could make it better.
Sure.
And also, when you were talking about the size of people's brains, that considers as if you're just an individual. Because we can talk to each other, our brain size, in fact, is infinite, because you sit around and have a meeting, 10 people have got 10 brains rather than just the one. I would have thought, how does one consider the development of being able to communicate?
Well, it's absolutely essential. And the Neanderthals point is interesting. This is back in 1994, when I was an undergraduate doing paleoanthropology at UCL, one of the standard essay questions was, could Neanderthals speak? I've muted this slide, but I'm going to unmute it now. And the answer over 3,000 words was they were capable of speech, but we can't know whether they did or not. Now, the reason we think that is because of one particular bone, the hyoid, which is this. If you feel at the base of your chin, you feel your neck there, there's a very, very sophisticated horseshoe-shaped bone called the hyoid, which in humans, in Homo sapiens, is sort of incredibly intricate, and there are at least 12 muscle attachments to that, which indicates that it is part of a very sophisticated system in speech. You can feel it moving up and down when you talk and when you breathe. It's the sort of white bit there, just next to the underneath the chin in Alice's drawing. Now, there's a Neanderthal hyoid was found from an Israeli site called Kabara which indicated that it had similar levels of complexity. And from an anatomical point of view, that indicates that Neanderthals were also capable of vocalization in a similar way to humans. Now, in terms of brain size, well, Neanderthals actually had slightly larger cranial capacity than Homo sapiens, and so there's no shortfall there in terms of the cognitive abilities required for speech. And then the modern era comes genetics, and in 2009 and 10, we get the full Neanderthal genome, and we look at a particular gene, one that a lot has been made of, called FOXP2, which is essential for speech and language in a very complex way that is often not reflected in how we talk about FOXP2 in the press. A lot of people talk about FOXP2 as the language gene. It is not the language gene because there are no genes for anything. It is a gene which is essential for speech and language development, but it also does a whole bunch of other stuff. Now, when we got the Neanderthal genome in 2009-10, it turns out that Neanderthals had exactly the same version of FOXP2 as Homo sapiens. So from a genetic and anatomical point of view, Neanderthals were capable of speech. By separating the distance between Neanderthals and humans and looking at both the genetics and the anatomical, the anatomy of both, it indicates that both of those human species had the capability of speech long before they split. Right? So 600,000 years ago, which is not the same thing as saying that Neanderthals could speak or that 500,000 years ago our ancestors could speak, but at least we were physically capable of doing it. Well, this is a long answer. I'm not even sure this is the question. Yeah, speech and communication is absolutely essential to human evolution, and we communicate, and our speech is... There's a Darwinian phrase, it's also in The Descent of Man, where he talks about our differences being of degree and not kind. And it's a really useful, interesting phrase. It puts us on an evolutionary spectrum, which says that these things are different on a scale rather than qualitatively. Now, in many cases, I think it's absolutely right, and it's an elegant phrase, and it's one that we should use more. In many cases, I don't think it's useful anymore. And, far be it from me to criticize Darwin, its universal application to describe everything from speech and language to, whatever, I think is no longer useful. Our speech and communication abilities trump all other animals by just orders of magnitude. And much is made of great apes that can communicate with some sophistication, have symbolic languages. They're not the same. They're not qualitatively the same. Even Coco, who died earlier this year, a gorilla in, San Diego? Yeah. It's a good job. It's really useful having these people I can check with. Had a lexicon of like 200 or 300 words, which is about the same as a 2.5-year-old or a 3-year-old. So it is qualitatively different, and I don't think by degree, but I think our speech and language is different by kind.
It almost be pretty essential too, because it means that if you...
Is this God? Oh, no, right, it's the same guy, right?
It also is developmentally in reverse. That if you can speak, you tend to have other people's thoughts, therefore your thoughts tend to grow. Therefore, it must be an exponential type of development. Not just being able to speak sort of opens a door, but because you can speak, your brain must increase how it works, one assumes.
Sure, but we must be wary of looking at these sort of linear models where one thing happens and another thing happens. The time and the complexities of the systems that we're talking about are immense, and it's important that we embrace the complexities of that, because of course it's not just to do with brains or language or syntax, it's also to do with the anatomy of our faces, the genetics that underlies that, our ability to hear. Speech is no use if you can't hear with the same sophistication. But, there's a long section on this in the book. Should we have another question?
Yes, we've probably got time for a couple more. Do we have any more female questioners who...
There's one from Mark Thomas up there, which just frankly scares me. So Mark is someone I've been working with for years. He's at UCL, he's a geneticist, an evolutionary biologist, and a lot of my last book was based on his work, and now a lot of this one is based on it too.
Okay.
Hi.
I just wanted to comment really on the whole language.
I said no comments. I said questions. They end with an upwards inflection.
Of course.
Thank you. No.
All right, so I'll say it in an Australian accent, and then. So, do you agree that that in fact, whilst the physical apparatus of vocalization is of course important, things like the hyoid bone, there are actually many other animals that can also vocalize, and some of which can imitate and vocalize rather in a similar way to us, as well as other sounds. But fundamentally, language is cultural. I mean, this is the fundamental point. It's what we learn. And so the idea that Neanderthals could or could not speak is not a question about really, I mean, if they've got the basic apparatus, then it's a question of, did they have the kind of population sizes that could maintain the kind of skills, the language skills that we have? And of course, there's gradation as well in language skills, but it's fundamentally, it's cultural, right? Would you agree?
Yes. I do. I absolutely agree with that. And you know, the genetic basis that underlies that development, again, is something that often gets, I think, overstated when we talk about these sorts of issues in public discourse, largely to do with the presence of this one particular gene, which we also know is essential for songbirds. And when it's damaged in songbirds, they can't vocalize. And so again, we go, okay, so FOXP2 is essential for vocalization, which it is. But I mean, it was discovered in the 90s at the place where I did my PhD, which is the Institute of Child Health, which is the research bit of Great Ormond Street. And it was because one particular family presented with 3 generations of speech, syntax, and grammar problems. And this was the early days of genetics and isolating genes using pedigrees, so you know, way before the Human Genome Project had even started. And using old-fashioned genetic techniques, which are now no longer used, this gene was identified. It was one of the first genes to be associated with a specific neurological defect. What's interesting about it is what I said about what the family presented with, because they presented with speech and syntax and grammar problems, all apparently caused by a single mutation in a single gene. Now that just indicates, well, 2 things. One, it indicates how sophisticated this gene is in terms of what it's doing in the body, right? So it is involved in psycholinguistics and anatomical issues. And all of these things are intrinsically linked. The second thing it indicates is we don't know what it does, right? And that's the story of genetics. We don't know what most genes do. We're in a golden age of genetics. We've identified almost all of the genes in the Human Genome Project, in the human genome now. And the truth is that we don't know what most of them do. And the ones we do know what they do, we don't know everything that they do. And so we make these icons. Chomsky talked about a genetic trigger that occurred probably over 10,000 years, but a genetic trigger that turned us from non-speaking apes into speaking apes. Chomsky's pretty good at linguistics, as I understand it, but that is a very simplistic, you're shaking your head, but this is a very simplistic view of the way evolution and genetics and anatomy and developmental biology and embryology and neuroscience works, and I don't think it's true.
Do you reckon you can answer your last question in 1 minute and 42 seconds? Then we can have one more.
Yes, I can.
Wherever we go.
Definitely can.
Here,
if it's a yes, no.
I was going to ask if you could please tell us about the hyena clitorises.
Oh, come on.
You mentioned
Great one
it.
to end on. I agree.
Sorry.
Well,
this is
yeah,
amazing,
sure.
by the way. This is amazing.
Absolutely. And how long have I got?
Okay, you now got 1 minute 15 seconds.
1 minute 15 seconds. Okay. Hyenas exist in a matriarchal social structure. Right? So they have dominant females, and social structure. The social status of the males is determined by proximity to high-ranking females. Right. The way that social structure is established in females is primarily by the licking of the clitoris between females. Now, the female clitoris, the clitoris in hyenas is about 95% the size of the penis and is anatomically very similar and is also erectile. So for a long time, ethologists were looking at hyena behavior and going, I don't understand why there are so many males and why they spend a lot of time licking each other's genitals, well, their penises. In fact, it was because what they were licking was the clitoris. They also give birth through the clitoris as well, but that's an added bonus. Anyway, the point was that if you want to use animal behavior to try and explain human behaviors, I don't know, if you were like a popular clinical psychologist who thought that lobsters were somehow significant in human evolution, then why not choose hyenas? Because that's how they arrange their social structure. And there you go, that's it.
Pretty good, only 12 seconds over. That was pretty impressive. But I think that means we'll have to call it a night, but all that remains is to say a very big thank you once again to Dr. Adam Rutherford. Thank you very much.